Okay, welcome everyone. This is the meeting of the Finance Committee. I'm calling it to order at 4:03 p.m. We do have a quorum, although we're missing a couple of our members. This meeting is being held remotely, so pursuant to a variety of actions by the legislature. And so all public comment will be via Zoom or via telephone. If you are on a phone line, you can raise your hand by, I think it's *9, and then we can bring you in for public comment. I apologize for the confusion on the start time of this meeting, but it was because of the holiday on Monday. I was not able to get it set up in time, so we had to push it back to 4 o'clock in order to give 48 hours notice as required. So I do apologize for that, but hopefully that means more people will be able to join in and listen. Let's go around. I see Kathy has joined us. Let's go around the room to see whether I can hear you and you can hear me. Matt?
Here, Bob.
Councilor Haneke?
Present.
Andy?
Present.
Kathy?
I'm here.
All right. Doug, we can hear you. I see Holly's here. Can we hear you? You're on mute, Holly.
Yes, I am here. And I just wanted to apologize to everybody because of the change in times. I did not communicate that to our auditors, and they had another commitment that they were not going to be able to make today. So we are rescheduling the auditors for, I believe it is the May 7th meeting.
Okay, no problem. Let's put that in there.
Pardon me, Bob, I'm noticing that Councilor Lord is in the audience. This meeting isn't posted as a joint meeting of the Council and Finance Committee. I just wanted to let you know. The meeting next week on the 25th, the public forum on the regional school budget is posted as a Finance Committee and Town Council meeting. So councilors will be joining that meeting.
Okay. Yeah, I think
Kathy, my connection is spotty, so I'm going to make you a co-host so you can help with public comment if you don't mind allowing people to talk.
That's fine. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy.
so. We have Kathy, did you want to say?
Yeah,
something?
I just have a quick question. I guess it's of Holly. In reading through the documents for the audit on the main document, which is the financial accounting, I have a couple questions just on terms, which is a little embarrassing because it may be the fifth year I've looked at these, or sixth year, but can I just send them to you, Holly? It's purely like, what's the definition of this and where does the number come from? So it's not on the auditor's report. I can go through you, Bob, if you want to, because others may have them. Okay, thanks.
Fine. Holly, if you could just respond to Kathy and myself, and then I'll just send it around to the committee so everyone has the same information.
Yep, that's fine. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think I'm trying to think. We have 7 attendees, but I think, well, Doug, can I ask you, is Mary Beth going to be able to join us? Do you know?
I really don't. I'm not sure. I think she might be traveling, so I don't think she's going to be able to.
So I think for those, our agenda is kind of blown up, but I think we should launch right into the review of the school budget to give Doug a chance to have his say, and then move on to other things, and then we'll have public comment after that. Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you. We sent you a bunch of questions, and Matt, did you want to recuse yourself?
Yeah, Bob, I'm going to go ahead and recuse right now. And Athena, thank you for moving me into the audience.
Okay, so Doug, can you just give us, your responses? And I mean, I know we asked a lot of different questions, so maybe you can kind of give us you don't have to answer everyone verbatim, but if you can give us a kind of a overall view of the budget as it evolved. So
let me ask this question. I'm not sure I've gotten those questions. So when were they sent? And from whom?
They came from Bob.
I sent them to Athena and to Lynn, but I did not send them to you. Okay, so, well, maybe I should just go through what we have. I know you won't be able to answer some of these right away, but we do have time. So maybe if we can get them to you, we can, you can fill in some of the blanks.
Sure.
One of the things, the first thing we wanted to know was, kind of over time, the staffing and enrollment trends. So, and we wanted every like 5 years, so it's not, super burdensome. But the idea is to look at how many FTE staff we have, how's that broken out between regular and special needs, how many students with disabilities. So to see the patterns over time or the trends over time. And maybe you can give us a verbal summary, but you can't give us the precise numbers right now.
Yeah, I can give you a brief overview. I mean, in general, our enrollments are down over the last several years, and so the tricky thing is that our when you scale that way, the students sort of leave in small numbers over time, but the sort of changes in staffing tend to be a little more stepwise because sort of reduces section requires a certain number of students at that grade level kind of grouping to cause that to happen. So while I think they track pretty closely, I mean, over time we've reduced staff in some areas in corresponding fashion to the student enrollment. It's probably not entirely kept exactly the same pace as the student enrollment. I think as far as, when you look at our number of students in special education, our percentage has gone up. What's really happened there is, and this is true in a number of our categories of students, depending on what you want to pick, English learners, et cetera, is that generally speaking, we've held fairly steady in the numbers of students in those categories, and the totality of students has gone down, so the percentage has gone up. So we see a slight increase in the percentage, or not so slight increase in the percentage sometimes, but you see an increase in the percentage of students, but the total number of students has stayed not too different. It's the overall student count that's gone down. So, and I think the other thing, just special education specifically, is I think some things are presenting differently than they have in past, and so we're seeing an uptick relative to need for students more in the mental health and social emotional sort of categories. That's a very, very broad, statement. I wouldn't, do I have that's anecdotal as well. I wouldn't suggest that I've crunched the numbers on that, but that's the indication there in some respects on that. But I think in a broad sense, I did a quick look earlier in like number of administrators we had, I don't know, 20 years ago versus now, or people in the sort of central office versus this change in enrollment. I mean, I just did it back in the envelope, and we've scaled kind of similarly. In other words, we've lost X number of students or percentage of students. We've lost a similar number of central office staff. So we've kind of scaled certainly centrally in a fairly parallel way to the students. My expectation would be that just by necessity, we've had to do the same thing with staffing, teaching, and other staff as well.
If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand, as Doug goes along. Councilor Haneke?
Yeah, I know you don't have the numbers, and it's going to be really important for us to get some numbers, by the 25th when we have a hearing. I'm not sure if we don't have written answers to some of these questions, we're going to be able to make a recommendation at that hearing on the 25th. But you talk about the numbers of special ed students staying approximately consistent, even if the percentage looks different because of the decrease in total enrollment. What do you know of the numbers of educators for special education, whether it be certified teachers or paraeducators over that same amount of time? Has that number stayed fairly steady? Or has that number increased or decreased? You know, where does that relate compared to, you know, a steady number of enrolled students or fairly steady enrolled students in special needs?
Let me see if I can answer that in a more concrete way. See how quickly I can get to perhaps an answer in that regard, broadly speaking. My guess would be, as far as, and I'll look up the actual numbers here a little bit more closely. You know, our trends in, you know, looking at special education instruction, so this would be teachers at the middle school and high school, have trended upward a little bit, but it's been steady over the last 22, 23, 24, last 3 years. You know, you look at, let me see if I can find the sort of paraeducator section, because that's where the big numbers are, is with our teachers and our paras. Yeah, those have trended up to some extent. You know, I can get you better numbers, you know, before your meeting on the 25th. So that is a Thursday meeting, just to make sure I got the date right. 25th,
Yes.
is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so some of those have trended up, and so some of that's dependent upon, you know, the specifics of particular kids' needs. So that makes a difference as to how, you know, whether or not kids need a paraeducator or don't need a paraeducator as part of their IEP. You know, those just to inform you broadly, or the group broadly, about, you know, the IEP process, individualized education plan. It's a contract between the district and the parents and the families about what's the best way and the the least restrictive way to provide educational services to those students. But it is, you know, binding. So once that agreement is signed, that is what we are compelled to provide in order to meet the requirements of that and to educate that student. And so if our students' profiles have changed, then we have to meet those needs, whatever those happen to be. So that's a factor that's sort of, you know, not purely financial sometimes, and it varies from year to year, you know, with regard to who the kids are and what their needs are. I mean, obviously, what we'd like to do with a lot of kids is if we can have them mature in a way as they get through and proceed through high school to, you know, mature out of some of that level of need. That'd be great. Not everybody does. And I think that you know, the kinds of things that we're seeing with regard to the pandemic and results of that are showing up in some of our staffing levels for sure.
Okay. Again, I don't know that you can answer this now, but we did like to also see a comparison between Amherst and other towns with a similar size 7 to 12 enrollments in terms of overall costs and you know, mix of regular and special needs. Again, it may not have all that information, but anything you can do to kind of like anchor what we're doing versus what other towns are doing in terms of the costs and, you know, what
You know, I can tell you,
needs.
I can tell you from a staffing standpoint, we have more staff than most other towns. You know, they're sort of similar in size. Do we have, you know, wildly different profiles? I don't know that we necessarily do or don't. But we do have more staff, in particular paraeducators. We have a much higher number than most other districts do. I think how we approach that is a little different. Some of it depends on, there's some of it's driven by the programming that we offer, which kind of skews things a little bit sometimes. In other words, there are, for example, we offer some in-district programs of a higher level of need, which have higher level of staffing. And we also have a lot fewer out-of-district placements than a lot of districts our size. So there's a sort of give and take between those two dynamics, because, you know, when we send kids out, And we've had an uptick in that this year, and it's a disconcerting one for us because we like to be able to have those kids be in our district. But that's part of the trade-off too when we start to compare with other districts is do they offer programming like we do that allows kids to remain within the district and also bolsters our in-house costs and in-house personnel counts. So we've got to kind of weigh those against each other. So take a holistic view to that. But I'll get you some more specifics. But certainly we have more paras than other people do, and I think we have more programming than other people do, and less out-of-district placements than other people do.
Councilor Hannigan?
Thank you. That comment just brought up a question in my mind. We talk a lot about per student costs and how that relates to the amount of money that is paid in charter tuition out of our district to other charters, because it's based on per student costs of our district. And how does that per student cost, I'm just trying to figure out relationships here. Not advocating something one way or another. I just have to state that before I ask this question. How does that relate to the charter per student cost formula for sending a student out of district versus providing all of those services in district? Does providing them in district go into our per student cost for charter school tuition costs, and does out of district placements go into the per student costs, or are they calculated separately?
I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer here. Yes and no. So some of the costs are included and some of them are not included. And so it gets kind of messy relative to sort of teasing that out. And I'll look into the specifics and see if I can, offer it in a more constructive way for you guys in getting prepared for the budget. But there are aspects, and this is one of the concerns I have about that charter funding formula is, the nature and severity of kids and their needs is different in a general public school versus a charter school. Charter school is still considered a public school, but when you have certain areas of focus, that sort of thing, it by default precludes certain students from pursuing that as an option. And so the kinds of level of need that they're dealing with is different. And yet I'm not sure all of that. Some of that's taken into account in the formulas, but not all of it.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
Does the formula for that charter school tuition include the out of district tuition placements? Or are those excluded from the formula?
I'm not sure exactly, because there's multiple pieces to an out-of-district placement. There's the actual placement itself. There's the transportation costs. There's, is there support for the student on the transportation? Those different sort of component pieces. And I'm not sure off the top of my head which are, which aren't, and to what extent.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so next set of questions really are ways of maybe alternatively addressing the FY25 budget. The first question here is, if we were able to do a one-time gift, say of $300,000, what would what's teaching staff for other positions would be the top priority for that?
That's a great question. I think that it probably depends on who you ask, but I think in the nitty-gritty of that, sort of in between, sort of what was talked about in February and what was talked about and voted on by the school committee in March. We haven't had that conversation about what about in between there. I think that in general, one of the lenses that the school committee took when they were taking this was to try to, any sort of student-facing positions are the ones that they wanted to restore. Obviously, those that have the greatest impact and have the greatest impact in a number of ways, primarily on students, but also staff, because we're going to use things like retirements and exits and that sort of thing to help mitigate the personal impact on individual personnel. And I think that it goes to, you have sort of core teaching things that you have to do. So special education requirements of like I said earlier, of the IEP, that's going to certainly be areas where we're going to try to bolster those a little bit. We're going to look at our most impactful areas of core academics And then, electives would be sort of the third tier. That's a broad sketch of it. I'd have to have the conversations I haven't had yet with the administration to talk about what's their practical approach. And some of it depends on course enrollments and sort of where the needs are from a standpoint of what kids have chosen. So, if they were expecting to cut, I'm going to make something up here, woodworking, which and then suddenly 25 kids sign up for woodworking, we need a section of woodworking, that kind of thing changes what the conversation was a month ago or 2 months ago. So those also play into the choices that we'll make as a district moving ahead. But I think, if you think about sort of the triage of trying to keep it away from students as much as we can, and those things that have the highest level of impact, which would be and requirements associated with them, like special education or core subjects that have to be taught to every student, and then electives. That's going to be the broad sort of lens that we take to that.
Bob, can I follow up on that
yeah,
one? Yeah,
sure.
Doug, I apologize. These didn't come to you earlier, especially this one, because this is, I think it requires, what you just did, trying to mull it over. So the notion is whether it's 200 or 300,000, and it's just, let's just for the time being say it's just Amherst giving you the money.
Right.
And trying to get a sense of, if you went back to the drawing board with staff, where would you most likely put that money compared to what you've shown with the cuts? So rather than trying to give us an answer now, it was trying to say, the ask of Amherst was 700,000, but something considerably less. And the other thing I want to say is that if this were just literally one time, so this just takes you through to next year, and then you're back where you are. Just trying to think through what would be the priorities internally, knowing that it would be student facing, but program areas or anything, it would be helpful for us to know. And I crafted this question, but I'm not convinced we've got $200,000, but it's a sense of something less than the ask. What would it buy? It's a pretty crass way of stating that. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate the ask, and it is a legitimate sort of thing. I was, we're trying to put together some materials for Saturday's meeting, and thinking about exactly that sort of thing. Is like, is there some in between we can have a conversation about? What does that mean? And I think the answer, not to be too glib, is that it depends. If it's sustained support, that's a very different conversation than if it's one-time support. Because if we, generally speaking, given what we've put back in with the budget that the school committee voted, are things that if not continued to be supported, so if it's one time, they just get reduced the following year potentially. If it's ongoing support, then it's a little different sort of strategic conversation about how some of those things play out over time. And like I said, I'll put together some answers with staff about that a little bit, and their thinking on those fronts. And again, there's a piece of it though that also depends on well, there's some strategies for the district as far as how do we compete in a market, because that's what we do as a school with charter and choice options out there. To what are things that retain students within our building? What evidence do we have that those have worked, those strategies? And then you also have, what are programs that we've been trying to encourage and develop, and what do we think kids are going to want to take? Because you want to sort of meet the kids where they want to be as far as those course offerings and programs that they have.
Thank you.
These next questions are I'm going to combine two that they really get at the specifics that you proposed. I mean, it's kind of complicated because you have the levels, you have the level services budget, then you have the original budget that was voted, and then you have the increased budget, which was which has been approved or voted by the school committee. But you basically had some, there was a focus on world languages in the sort of the final budget, or you had originally proposed that cut, and then that was restored in the final budget. So, and then there was some other counseling and some other positions. So first of all, how many of these were ESSER supported positions versus, just other positions? Number two, why these particular cuts rather than other cuts? And then sort of associated with that is, I know that there was a lot of concern among the parents at the town council meeting about the loss of AP classes, in languages, further on downstream when the students are middle school students are juniors and seniors. But what about working with Amherst College and UMass to get more availability of college level language courses, which could be, my son took a maths class at UMass and got college credit for it. So it could be quite beneficial for the students. So I just wanted to kind of if you can just kind of give us some idea of the rationale behind the specific cuts that were proposed.
Yeah. So, so just to the ESSER question first, the way we supported the budget this year was a general support of ESSER. So it sort of pushes into a variety of areas, mostly in our expense budget, and not really staffing positions. So we really don't have any staff that are explicitly, there may be some that ultimately get funded that way, but we didn't explicitly fund staff with ESSER funds. It was more general budget support, mostly on the expense side, but not exclusively. We'll sort of see how that plays out over the course of the current year and even into the new year to some extent. To the question of sort of why some of these, I think some of it has to do with, so some of it was at the high school, they had some reorganization of departments. So really reducing the number of departments, and it changes the amount of time released for department head work. It makes it harder to get that work done, but it is an economy that reduces the amount of teaching staff because there's less time released to do department head. And so there's some loss in that, administration, coordination, curriculum support, et cetera, that department heads do as a result of that, but it preserves sections of classes for kids. That's one piece of what was in there. And I think then the other piece is relative to sort of schedule and how our schedule fits and how it's framed and sort of how many kids are sitting in some of the sections we have now with the arrangement of schedule and course offerings that we have, and looking at that going, that's a pretty expensive section, right? And so can we structure that in a different way? And it's also, the pushback, understandably, is that if you change to a different model of delivery, it's a very different program. And so it does limit, less is less. So if you offer less, then the opportunities for kids are less. And whether it's world language or mathematics or pick a topic, it's really a variety. That was one where the sort of class sections gave opportunity to maybe think of it differently. And it does, put limitations on what kids are able to explore by the time they finish their senior year. I mean, obviously, we're always looking at opportunities to connect with the colleges to do stuff. They're very good partners with us in that regard. We have a variety of opportunities for kids, and so we try to do that when we can. Nice thing about AP classes is they sit during the school day. In the languages in particular, they tend to be co-taught at the same time. So we'll have a section, a time of day, that has both an AP class going on simultaneously with, like a level 4 or level 5 language class. So the classroom might have 15 students in it, and 5 are in an AP class and 10 are in level 5, and the one teacher that's sort of straddling those two worlds. And so we do do some economy along those lines to try to make things work for us as well. There's some limits to what that can do and what experience that is for the kids. And if you offer less early in the process of world language, then to get to an AP level requires some significant choices by students in their scheduling and their elective options as they go through to get to that place. In other words, if you wanted to get, if you limit their choices to begin with, then to get to an AP level requires essentially what they call doubling up, which means, instead of taking sort of one world language per year, you take 2 1 year. Same thing happens in mathematics. Same thing can happen in other courses as well. Not optimal in a lot of ways, and in some ways, it's an option, but it's not. If you're taking 2 languages in a year, that means there's some other elective you're not taking, right? So it is limiting your choices in some form or another, whether it be in world language or in some other option that you might have explored had you had more flexibility in your schedule.
Council Haneke?
Yeah, the doubling up thing, I know this is not necessarily the finance committee's purview, but I do have to say that that's actually not possible for some of the languages in my view. And so I think you have to be forthright about that. For Chinese, for example, I mean, unless you're going to allow someone to take Chinese 1 and Chinese 2 at the exact same time, same semester, same time, you can never double up in Chinese with the current way of Chinese offerings. Chinese 1, 2, and 3 are in the spring semester. Chinese 4, 5, AP, and culture and literature are in the fall semester. So unless you're taking 1 and 2 at the same time, or 2 and 3 literally at the same time, which is probably not doable because you need 1 to take 2, you can't double up, and you can't take 4 before you take 3. So to say that that's a possibility when talking about the language cuts, I think is disingenuous. And I know that's not where finance deals with, but I think the school should be more forthright about what the middle school cut to languages would potentially mean in the future, which is for some languages, no AP, given the current schedule, unless the schedule changes.
And I think that's the critical point that would be made, would be that potentially the schedule could be differently. So the fact that we currently only offer levels 1, 2, and 3 in the spring could be altered so as to allow kids the opportunity. But it also depends on, demand. Is there a sufficient level, like if you have to offer level 2 in both the fall and spring, then, you have to have enough students to take it to make that worthwhile. But it's within the realm of possibility. But I get your point, though. It's also, as currently structured, would that allow you to get there? No. And you can't simultaneously take 1 and 2 because you don't have the efficient foundational skills to do 2 if you haven't done 1 yet. So, I get your point, and I think that the thinking is that likely the avenue would be to alter the schedule to make that a possibility. I think the other thing that we have to weigh here as we think about this, and this is, and it doesn't matter that, pick a program area, and this is the conundrum, is what do we offer, what can we offer, and how many students are impacted by those kinds of things. And that's part of the calculus too, is when we start thinking about some of these choices, and it's like we don't want to put those limitations, and is it better to have, and I'm not throwing this as a value judgment at all. It's like, is it better to have AP Chinese or AP calculus of some sort versus class sections in 9th grade of 30 versus 22? I mean, that's some of the trade-offs that are happening with those differences that are all part of the mix of this, and trying to find those balances between those things. And that's the struggle we're going to have as our enrollment shrinks a little bit. And we want to try to continue to offer this wide spectrum of programs, which are great, and we'd love to. But we're going to have to think about that very carefully over the coming years as to whether we can continue. Do we just have the student population to sustain some of the offerings we've had in the past? Or do we, do something else with school choice? Or do we, I think we need to explore all of those, ideas, sort of simultaneously, because, world language is the area that got a lot of conversation in the last few months. It could have been about a different area. We could have been having it about math or social study offering or any of the others. I think so. I don't want to, hyper focus on one. I think there's a more systemic thing we've got to look at and think about over the coming years to structure ourselves in a way that is functional and as deep and as broad as we can do for all of our students.
Kathy?
Yeah, I want to just build on, as Bob said, he asked a complicated, almost three-part question, but the Amherst and UMass part of it, Doug, I know you've been over there at least once to say, can you offer us some financial help? And I know Amherst College does do some in-kind work, particularly with the elementary schools. They gave me a list, but I'm really wondering about the higher level courses across the board. If we could have if there's been an exploration, or could there be, of the advanced placement courses, the ability to take a course. So what I know about is people who did physics, who did math. I'm not sure I knew anyone who did language, but I'm just thinking, in my son's piece, but there is, if you do languages, UMass is rich in the scope of languages that's offered. And I don't know how much union contracts preclude a student teacher who is going for a teaching degree in a language or in an area, coming in and being a lead teacher for an extra language course or something. But trying to think of what our town is rich in is other educational institutions. And they could write this up as in-kind support if we had a more formal arrangement, and whether that could be done in time for September, or could be done with this is our glide path and where we're going. So that's my longish question on seeing them as research sources particularly for our regional schools.
Yeah, I think that those are all areas of, that we're interested in continuing to explore and partner with them. I mean, we do have to have and consider schedules when we have kids off campus. It's like, how quickly can they get there and get back, and how does it fit in ways that have meaning, and then when do the colleges and university offer those classes too? In other words, we're not going to dictate to the university how they're offering classes. Now, granted, something like world language, which they do a lot of, because all the arts and science majors have to take language, so they offer a lot of sections of various world languages. So there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think also that schedule question is a real one that we have to consider as a part and parcel of this too. Yeah, I think there's opportunities how quickly we can get something more formal than we have now. I mean, we have a few things in place at present, and I think I can kind of pose those questions and see what staff who've dealt with some of that, what complications arise when they try to plug those things in.
Thank you.
Doug, the committee has there's been a little bit of concern expressed about there's apparently, and don't take this the wrong way, but the apparent lack of planning. In other words, we had this fiscal cliff coming. It doesn't appear that it's suddenly on us now, and now we have a big hole in the budget, and next year will be a bigger hole. There's the school committee, regional school committee, didn't really go through this at the Four Towns meeting before. It kind of got sprung to us. So some of the questions that we have are related to kind of what from the outside appears to be a lack of planning and a lack of understanding that that there has to be some changes made in order to as ESSER funds were used for purposes as they weren't not available, we had to there has to be some plan to adjust for that. So anyway, I don't take this to be pejorative. It's just there is a concern about these things suddenly hitting us.
Yeah, I would suggest, I wouldn't say they're suddenly hitting us. I think they've hit us a little bit over the last couple of years, and will continue to hit us a little bit. I think that we have been trying to take some strategic approaches to how we've used our ESSER funding, how we've used some of our other funds that we can leverage a little bit more control. So how we've used our school choice over the last couple of years, how we've used our other revolving funds. We have a few revolving funds that we have intentionally built balances in order to, over the last couple of years, because we could use ESSER funds and then preserve those for smoothing out this drop. I don't think we're quite in as severe a place as some other districts, and yet it's still a pretty significant hit. And I think from the other thing I'd say that's been compromising our ability to be planful about some of this is I've been splitting time as talented and capable and as staff are in the business office. I'm still splitting some time there. There's a level of institutional knowledge I have that I haven't been able to share with him because there's only so many hours a day. And I think that when you look at a building principal is split across 2 buildings in the middle school, high school, which we're trying to shift away from now. But those things all contribute a little bit as well. So there's been a number of factors there that have interrupted or made it difficult to be as planful as we'd like to be. And I think that could we have been more planful? Absolutely. I mean, I think we've done some things. I think we're leaning into that. If you look at in some materials I sent, there's some things at the top that are adjustments where we're shifting costs onto revolving funds for our Summit Academy, for some of our administrative staff, et cetera, that we're able to do that because we didn't spend those during the pandemic dollars, and we can sustain those for a little while to help us sort of bridge this time frame. And so there's it's a mixed bag of things. Could we have done more? Absolutely, don't doubt it at all. And it's a tricky thing. I think the other thing is that the sort of revenue sources that we have, particularly Chapter 70, have really been very flat. And the difficulty is, given this, that's, a couple of years ago, that was in the 31% of our revenue was Chapter 70. It's now down to 27, 28%. When it goes up less than 1 percentage point, our costs are going up, whether they go 4% or they go up 8%, you're still behind when your revenue doesn't kind of keep pace. So that's another thing that's kind of compounding. And in a way, the ESSER funds, as Chapter 70 has been sort of flat, as we've shifted funding to other districts in the Commonwealth, because the Commonwealth has certainly spent more money on Chapter 70. It's just been targeted to some districts that are really in a higher level of need than we are. The ESSER funding has made that shift less noticeable because we've been able to use ESSER funds to kind of alleviate that shortfall in direct support from the state. And then I think that now that the ESSER funds are running out, that small percentage increase in revenue from the state is much more noticeable to us. And that coupled with some of the revenue estimates from the state are lower, so they're much more cautious about their budget for fiscal 25, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a kind of compounding effect here. But anyway, so I think there's some ways that revenue problem's been a little bit hidden because we've had ESSER funds to help us a little bit, but it's kind of becoming much more front and center at the present time.
Andy?
Yeah, Doug, following up on what you just said, I think that those of us who've watched the budget year for year over a long period of time know that what happens each year is that we start with the district calculating the level services budget from the prior year and finding out the size of the gap based upon information at the Four Towns meeting, and then finding what the gap is. And there seems to be always more reductions than additions or anything else. So what it's really evident is that over a long course of time, the inflation each year in cost is exceeding the inflation in revenue. And you know, gets then to the question of what caused us to reach such a steep cliff this year, or was it just a matter that it was going to happen and this is the year it happened? And then the other thing is that I had talked with John Trickey in Pelham, and John said that he had been asking about a 3-year plan to see what we could expect to happen over the next 3 years, given what's being asked of this year. And is that something that we're going to be able to see on Saturday?
Yes. So we're working on that right now and looking at that. I mean, there's a ton of assumptions that fall into that are going to make people a little, uncomfortable because there's a lot of, unknowns in there. But at the same time, we're going to do the best we can to sort of estimate those things out over a couple of years' time to sort of see either compounding effects or the reduction of compounding effects on some things. I don't see the Chapter 70 revenue unless there's a major change to Chapter 70, or if the Student Opportunity Act continues to play out as it will over the next couple of years. I don't see that revenue source is suddenly getting much better. So we're going to be still in a somewhat revenue starved circumstance relative to our expenses. And while we have declining enrollment, I'm not sure and some of how we've coped in past years is that we've had some of the reductions make sense relative to declining enrollment. So the need to be exactly level services isn't always perfectly true if we have reductions in the number of kids. But yeah, we'll put together some numbers and project out for the next couple of years and sort of see how things look, in different scenarios of revenue and expense and how that might play out in the coming years. I've had multiple conversations literally today just talking about how do we sort of present this, how do we make sure the numbers are right, what kind of assumptions do we want to include or not include, and that sort of thing to get those numbers for the whole group on Saturday.
Yeah, Doug, just to follow up on that a little bit. One of the questions that is in this sheet is the sort of impact of changes in the middle school to the high school. In other words, if you reduce languages in the middle school, how does that impact the high school? And so I would hopefully your assumptions will take that into account. That if we make certain cuts in the middle school, then or we support, we add certain things in the middle school, then we have to, this is what the impact in the high school is. So, because that's another dynamic there that.
Yeah, as best we can, we'll try to put that in. It may be a little broader cut than that. There's a number of things that have very sort of broad assumptions associated. So sometimes something more specific like that is a little harder to track in a real way. But at the same time, we're going to try to capture the intent of that as we move through the years.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Haneke?
A couple things with this conversation. So the first one is much more of a not related to this at all, but I was looking for just now the line item budget. And it's not on the town's website or the school's website under the budget office, under budget links at all. When you go through the business office budgets and all of that, the last budget you get is the FY24 one in documents, unless I'm looking in the wrong area. It's very hard to find on the school's website. I did eventually find it in a January presentation in board docs. Not with the budget hearing. It was not attached to the meeting where the Regent School had their budget hearing. Only the presentations were and the final one pager. I think that lack of openness is a problem. It should be easily found. It shouldn't take me 20 minutes to find.
Yeah.
It
So-
should be attached to every agenda where the budget is discussed, in some sense, or easily found on a website, and it wasn't easily found. But that's for, for future planning. When we talk about cuts and we talk about level services, the level services budget you presented that then had cuts, never got adjusted for things like lower insurance rates. That got adjusted and was presented as an adjustment at the end of level services. But there's no change to levels. There's no change to services when insurance is cheaper than you projected in January. In June, in April, when the insurance rates came out and we knew what they were, the budget document was not changed to reflect lower insurance rates. It was listed somewhere at the end, 3 documents later, as an adjustment. But that makes the level services budget look higher than a level service budget actually is. And I think that presents a lot of problems for us trying to really figure out when you're trying to compare documents and compare years and compare percentage increases, what an actual level services budget is. Because we never see that number in flat out numbers, in a sense. And one of the things that I've struggled with throughout all of these discussions in my 5 years is the town government side has also had to live with a 3% or a 4% increase every year in its operating budget. And it's presented a level services budget within that number every year, without need for major or any real cuts to personnel, despite personnel also being the very significant part of our budget that it is to the region too. The region's level services budget was over 8% increase this year. And so I'm trying to struggle, and I struggle with, and I'd like your take on why is a region's level services budget consistently well above the 3 or 4% that the town can regularly offer basically every year, when the town can do it, or even when the elementary school could kind of do it this year? What is different about the region that the region can't seem to keep its level services within what is typically known as the available or likely increase every year in operating, in that budget number, while the town and even the elementary school seems to be closer to being able to do that?
So I'll start with the first thing, which was the sort of funding the line by line. I'm sorry that it wasn't posted into the budget document section of the website. Again, one of those things that we haven't done. We generally only do sort of 2 versions of that full budget, because it takes a while to put together. So when we go to make those reductions and adjustments, those are specific. Sometimes there's single lines within the budget. Sometimes they're multiple lines. For example, if you're looking at like reductions in so the teaching staff ones that were proposed, those might hit 3 or 4 different budget lines. And you have to sort of parse those across those budget lines and then make sure things add up to the bottom and that sort of thing. So we typically do, when we get to it, is the sort of first version of the budget and then the final version of the budget. And that's why things like adjustments to health insurance are shown as an adjustment to the budget. And I would agree with you that that's part of why we have an adjustment section. It's not considered a cut. And I think to say that adjustments that reduce the costs, like most of the things that are in the adjustment section, are truly shifts to the level services. I agree with you that the level services, in its truest sense, would have those folded in directly, and ultimately do before we get to the final version of the budget. We typically, like I said, when we get the final adjustments and votes from everyone, we do take all of those adjustments and the cuts and or additions and push them into the specific budget lines. And so, when we did that for fiscal 24, for example, if you look at the health insurance line, that's adjusted from what it was, in January of 23, when we were talking about the same kind of estimate of cost and then real cost. So we do it. It just doesn't happen very, in a super timely way. And I'm sorry that you couldn't find it. Anyway, so to the second question, why is it, the regional budget, particularly the sort of overall expenses are growing at that rate? There's a few different pieces of the puzzle. So I'll say this. So ESSER support for the budget is one piece of that. So that's a component of the cost of, we got 8.29% or something in our overall increase there. Some of it's, like you say, adjustments to health insurance and some of those other things that actually make it not 8.29% in real numbers. So that's a subtlety of it and timing of presentation. But so that's a piece. ESSER's a piece because of the shift in the amount of available funds from ESSER. So the current fiscal 24 budget's getting supported by about $1.1 million in ESSER funds, which means the expense side of the equation is about $1 million higher than would be the case. And this coming year, it's $500,000. So there's $600,000 of that, 8.3% that are just the differential of ESSER funding available. So that's part of what drives it. I think the other things we start to see is we negotiate contracts with employees. Depending on what the COLAs are, that makes a difference. The other thing is that we've gotten younger as an organization. So the number of staff we have at the top step, which would be just getting, just for those that don't know, we have steps and COLAs. So if you are a new hire, you tend not to be at the very top step. And so when you, from one year to the next, tend to get a cost of living increase as well as a step increase. And then for staff that have been with us a while, they end up at the top of the grid. And so they're just in cost of living increases. So, when you have a younger staff, so you have fewer people at the top of the grid, you've got a higher level of inflationary pressure year over year. And I've seen that over the time I've been with the district. So when I started with the district, we had, just shy of about 70% of our staff were at the top staff. Now we're probably closer to 50. And depending on which department. So that puts a little more inflationary pressure on things. And what we can negotiate with our staff is a factor too. And it's, it's a fair negotiation. So, we go into it, we, sort of press the point to try to, make sure that the choices we're making collectively around that bargaining is fully understood. In other words, when we negotiate the cost of living, that has a cascading effect in every year after that. And that's regardless of which contract we're in. So we try to keep that in mind. So I think, we've got ESSER's one piece of the puzzle. I think that we've got a younger staff. You see that on the Amherst side, not as much on some of that. The ESSER differential is smaller. The staffing differential is smaller. We've got some standalone expenses that are greater in the region because it is a separate standing financial entity. There's ways in which, a municipal district sort of shares some costs with the town and has some economy of scale there with the town. I think the other thing, just back to sort of how the town does some of its reductions, staff turnover may be a factor for them. It sometimes helps us as well. I mean, they may have more of that. I think the other thing is that they don't present their budget the same way. So they may be making reductions or changes before level services gets sort of framed. And I don't say that as a negative approach or a critique of the town and how they function, but they may be, and I don't know for certain offhand, how they've done it recently, but how they frame, sort of level services could be different. I mean, we take a snapshot in November essentially to get started. That's a pretty early snapshot, and a lot of things change. They may not be taking a snapshot as early. I think there's a general higher level of stability in their staffing and the knowns and unknowns because we have a dependency on who the students are and what their needs are. And so that changes things for us a little bit and creates a little more of a dynamic situation as far as staffing. And we just have a lot more people. The town hires and has on staff, a couple hundred. We have about just, 600 and some odd across all 3 districts. I should be clear on that. But I think all of those are factors in the puzzle.
Kathy?
No, I'm okay. Sorry, it's a leftover.
Leftover. Okay. You've touched on a lot of these other issues.
But Bob, I do have one.
Go ahead.
I have a question. I mean, this is because there were headlines over in Northampton. If the union would reopen the contract and take a 1-year freeze just on the COLA, is there any estimate on what the savings is for that? And again, you can't answer that off the bat, but I'm just thinking of, if the what you just described as with more people moving up the steps, it doesn't mean people are on a freeze necessarily. A lot of people aren't on a freeze. They'll be progressing up a step. So it's kind of how many people are at the top where this would be a genuine freeze. And I know it was a really difficult contract negotiation to get to yes. So and some of this was brought up during those negotiations with the revenues for the school. Chapter 70 are only going up by this much. If the cost of people working there goes up by a lot more, it's going to hit positions. But I just, if there is a rough way of getting that number, that would be useful. And I don't need it now.
Actually, I did look at that. And you're suggesting 0% COLA versus what's currently in the contracts?
I mean, clearly there's something between 0 and what's in the contract. There's half of
Right.
it, or yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah. Broadly speaking, and this is a very broad, the difference between 0 and 3% COLA across is in the $500,000 range, just to broadly, probably a little higher than that, but that gives you the sort of order of magnitude there.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks very much.
The other thing I'll say though is, I mean, part of the negotiations and the urgency, understandably, on the staff's part is, we're all experiencing inflation, in recent years of 7-8%. So there's a reason why nobody's happy about inflation, because it makes us all poorer, and it hits people hard. And so, when we talk about things like, our health insurance going up 9.74%, yeah, we as a district carry a big chunk of that cost, but the individual employees who have health insurance with us also have their rates go up that same percentage. And so that bites out of their COLA. And so it's a difficult conundrum around that. But
I totally, I had a 10-year history of being on the union side. So yes, I completely understand that, but it was just a question on where a stopgap to get us through a year might be, that saves positions. So thanks.
Yeah, we also had some questions. There's some questions in here about, kind of, because Amherst is part of the 4 towns entity. What happens if, like, Amherst decides to do something, but the other towns don't? And I know there's the 3 and the 4, but I mean, if we were to, somehow add some money and the others towns didn't add it, would that throw things off, in terms of, E&D balances, and, if there is an excess of that, what percent gets returned to what town and all that? Is there a way to deal with that, or is it just unprecedented, so you don't really have a process for it?
Well, actually, a couple of years ago, after the fiscal year had started, Amherst found itself in a positive circumstance with their revenue or expenses. I'm not sure which, but they had additional funding available, and they did a mid-year appropriation to each of the departments, not just the schools. When they did that, the regional schools took that as a gift, and at the direction of the finance director, he said, let's include that in the base for the moving forward. And so it kind of depends on that question about whether it starts to mess with the sort of balance of things. If we do, if Amherst, for whatever reason, outside the assessment method, appropriates a chunk of money to the district, sort of a core question is, do you want us to count that as part of the base? In other words, when we go to say, oh, it's a 3% increase from last year, are we counting that gift or are we not counting that gift? It's a critical question. And I think that that makes a big difference, for all the calculations, and it does shift things. Another, I think the other towns are considering that kind of an option as well, as like, might we do a non-assessment type of appropriation? I think the critical question is, when we go to do fiscal 26, do we consider that part of your base assessment or not? If you consider it as part of the base assessment, then it tends to not create quite the same problems because the revenue is sort of projected to be there. If on the other hand, it's considered entirely separate from that, then we've got that gap of funding to fill, much like when the ESSER money runs out. So there's good and bad about it.
Okay, well, I mean, we have a lot of other, there's some other specifics in there, but it's not worth going through all of them right now. I think, does anyone else have some general questions about that for Doug? Okay, I don't see any.
I don't have a general question, but so I don't repeat Mandy's search for the more detailed document. Doug, if you could just send us a link. I've never quite figured out where to go when I go to the ARP site for something. And when I just did ARPS and budget, I found 2018 information. So, I know the difficulty of keeping up sites, but if you could just keep us linked, because I know you had told us at the Four Towns meeting that the total charter enrollment and what we spend on charter is in that document. And I was able to go to the DESE site and get charter dollars, net dollars, total dollars, and people dollars for both our regional and elementary. And I think even taking in half that amount keeps us whole as a region, so I know that's not going to happen by September, but $2 million when we're sending 21-ish net versus 5,000 when we go to a district school. If we went to 10, it's suddenly a huge amount of money multiplied on the kids. So I think not enough people know that information, and you've done a pretty good job on talking about Chapter 70 almost being flat as opposed to growing. So it's a shrinking share. But that's part of what has been the pressure because of the declining enrollment. But that's the charter issue is a very different issue. It's the basic funding of charters was set up in a way that hurts. And it doesn't hurt just Amherst. It hurts some of the other regional schools as well. And it's completely out of our control. So I just think if you could send me the link, it's useful for me to have the detail. And once I find the link, maybe I'll be able to find it again because I keep links. So that would be great. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Councilor Haneke?
Yeah, this a mix of questions, sort of, which is, so there's the region budget that was passed that we are considering right now, and then what I'm calling, for ease of or lack of a better term, the guidelines budget, which is 700,000 lower. I mean, I just don't, lack of a better term. The budget we thought we'd be looking at until the region passed something 700,000 higher. What, if any, planning is going on in your offices and with the school committee in case the region budget is not passed? because of budget deadlines of June 30 and all. Is the plan, is there a plan? If that plan is to present the cuts as presented previously, I believe when the school committee asked, are there other places to potentially cut spending to meet the guideline budget? Your response was no. I think, I don't know. What other places did you consider for potential cuts, or how did you go about making those decisions of getting to there versus other things? For example, I briefly looked at this, and athletics has more expenses than the revolving fund and revenue. I don't know where those expenses get paid from, whether that's the general fund budget for the school district. If it is, was there a consideration of looking at athletics becoming revenue neutral instead of expense, instead of an expense line as part of the cuts? Or were there other places that you looked and disregarded? Or how did you go about doing that? And is there a plan to revisit that? Or is there in planning now a potential to revisit that if the school committee budget is not adopted by 4 towns?
So I think, so the difference between sort of the conversation we had in February at the 4 towns meeting versus the budget that was voted at school committee, that difference is about, I'll tell you exactly, $941,975 higher. We're still reducing almost $750,000. A fair number of that is adjustments, which are changes to the actual level services budget. So to your point earlier, nonetheless, there's about 300,000 of that. About half or so of that 750 are adjustments and refinements of estimates of cost, but the other half of it is broadly is other reductions in other places. And so we had and have some open positions or positions that will be open as a result of retirements in some places throughout the district. So we looked at those. We know we have certain cost increases in our expenses. We look through all of those. We do, as we build the budget, we go through sort of every line and look at sort of past history, and there are some areas where you look and it might not have had this bit. We have like $3,500, and then we've only spent $1,000 in the last 3 years. But then there's some other line right near it that might have spending that we have sort of back and forth. So there's a point where we kind of think in terms of the totality of given sections, with history as our guide in many ways. And there's a lot of those that you can't zero out. And like we know we have property insurance, and property insurance as a whole, sort of industry wide, pretty significantly increasing over the next couple of years. Recent history with our other kinds of insurance are driving costs up. So when we really want to make a difference in our budgets, it's often driven by people, because the things that are of a more flexible nature in our sort of raw expenses are, they're a much smaller component of our budget, and a number of them are not, very movable. So we still got to heat the buildings, we still got to pay for electricity, and other utilities. So those things don't have a lot of wiggle as far as making reductions. We have curriculum materials we have to buy. We still got to purchase some paper and whiteboard markers and that stuff. Those don't have a lot of movement. And even if you zeroed them out, you're talking in the hundreds of thousands, a couple 100,000 maybe at most, if you zeroed them out and you couldn't have school. There's some of those things you'd have to buy anyway. So you can't really zero them out. But we looked at all of those. Specifically athletics, we have, most of that cost is carried by the program and the fees. We haven't adjusted the fees over the last couple of years. That's on our agenda for this fall to look at those fees. Currently, we carry just a few salaries in the budget. And again, that's one of those areas where over the course of the pandemic, we built some balance in that revolving fund to help us out. And then we'll review the sort of structure of our fees for that to see what we can do as far as generating a little more revenue there. But I think all of those are all of those things that are of that sort are all under consideration. Most of them at this point are ones we can't take action on right away, and even and most of the ones that we have some ability to do that is we have or will, and they're small differences at this point. I think as an organization, we're going to have to look more deeply at systemic kinds of changes, which are harder, longer term kind of things. But I think, if you just sort of look out at the coming years, and this will be part of the messaging, we'll see, barring significant changes in some revenue sources, we got to think about how we're structured differently and what that entails. And it takes a bit to think about those things that really fundamentally shift the paradigms that we use. And those take time and energy to kind of explore and dig into and evaluate and think about what their impact are. So it gets back to Bob's question earlier about sort of, hey, if we make this change in world language in 7th grade, what happens 3 years from now when those kids start to get to high school and want to take whatever? It's like, what are those impacts? So we definitely want to try to look at those kinds of longitudinal impacts as well when we make those reductions. I think if I got to the other points that I wanted to make on that front, but yeah, we definitely, we look through, and try to find things. There's, there are, needs that we have to invest in. We have to continue to sort of work on and chip away at, in much the same way we think about capital and wanting to spend regularly on capital so that we don't get too far behind. There are things we do in a similar way within our operating budget around, things like evaluating curriculum, that we want to think of that in a similar way. It's like, oh, well, do we need to invest in a new curriculum for this? Does that have a grant opportunity that allows us to, or does it have a bunch of materials that need to go with it that we're going to need to plan and budget for? So I think we have to think about some of those things too as we go ahead, as what things do we need to do to stay in a regular cycle of improvement.
Councilor Haneke?
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but something you just said struck me, and it's part of sort of some of the questions I think we asked about planning, which did I interpret what you said? Am I interpreting correctly that systemic longitudinal planning around cuts hasn't been done? And does that actually mean that the cuts that were proposed for the guidelines budget, the 900,000 less than the school committee voted, that those cuts were not longitudinally thought of in terms of how those would impact budgets, but not just budgets, but the educational system and offerings going forward into the 3, 4, 5 years from now? Were they really just what's easiest to do in the here and now instead of a truly thought out plan over the long term, knowing that this cliff has needed a plan? Am I interpreting what you just said is what I just said sort of in the correct vein of the cuts that were proposed to the teaching staff were potentially the easiest to make in the here and now without necessarily regard to a 4, 5, or 6 year plan in educational philosophy, planning, and offerings, in that longitudinal sense that you thought of you spoke about of systemic strategic planning, and that hasn't been done with these cuts? Is that correct?
So I would offer it differently. I think that longer view is a part and parcel of all the process we take all the time. So I don't think we've been absent of doing that at all. I think, however, if you look at sort of churn in administration, so that's a pretty critical piece when you start talking about building level decisions, when you have change in staffing, it's at the administrative level, both at the building level and centrally, that makes it harder to do them well and to have consistency across that and stability in those evaluations of longitudinal impact. So I think it's a little bit of both. So I think that while we need to do that and continue to do that, and it is something we always do, I think have we done it at the depth that we'd like to have over the last year or two? Probably not. We've been on to some other topics and had some churn in some staffing that make it difficult to do that well. That's not to say it doesn't happen. I think it's difficult to do at the deepest levels would be maybe the way I would phrase that. So I think it's I agree and disagree with you simultaneously, I guess is some of what I would say.
Okay, and sorry, one more quick then follow up. If we were to fund the regional school budget this year with but those longitudinal plans need done, say, or even if we weren't, how do we guarantee that happens? How do we know that what you're saying is necessary and needs to be done would actually be done?
Well, I think that's there's a couple things. So certainly, my expectation is if we hire a superintendent, I'll go back to business office. So I'm hearing this directly from you guys. And so from my lens, that's certainly a piece of the puzzle. But I think it's also important for you guys to share that point of view with superintendent candidates and with a new superintendent, because it's going to be critical for them to understand the context in which they operate and get that feedback from the sort of member towns. So I think it's a twofold piece. I mean, obviously I'm hearing it, I'm thinking about it, have been thinking about it. And one of the advantages, I mentioned earlier where, there's some things that I'm still sort of carrying as a business official and, institutional knowledge, that kind of stuff. And the skills we're building with some of my staff are going to be helpful for them to be able to kind of dig in and work on some of this. However, it's a pretty critical conversation with the buildings and those administrations and staff, in concert with the superintendent to really think about that, impact and strategic planning for multiple years. So I think sharing that with those superintendent candidates and asking those kind of questions of them are pretty critical.
Kathy?
My question, Doug, I feel like we've really put you on the hot seat, but mine is slightly off from the pure regional budget, from my switching onto my hat of new elementary school is going to be grades K through 5, and the 6th grade is supposed to move up to the regional school. And there was a designation of an offer of $500,000 of ARPA money to help smooth the way. And what I had understood is some of that was going to go to redoing some bathrooms. There might have been some painting, some other things getting ready, but the region said not ready yet. So what my worry is, if you're not ready yet, but the money goes away and you need the money next year, where's it going to come from? Because when the new school opens up in 2026, the plan is there isn't a 6th grade moving into it. So I just don't know where that fits in the overwhelming larger budget picture that you're facing for next year, that this is a piece that's not that far down the road. So the ARPA money, and I just want to end with the ARPA money has not been spent yet. It's been designated, so it hasn't gone away. And my understanding is if there were a fairly concrete plan of what to do with it before the end of December, and most of it would be spent before the end of December 2026. We can be using the ARPA money. So it doesn't mean it has to be spent before. And since the new school is supposed to open in September 2026, that money would likely. So I'm hoping you go back and think about it. I asked the town manager and he said, if they said they don't have time to use it right now, or they don't have a plan for it, but I think the town is on the ARPA money side, has that one-time money to help with that. So I'll stop. But that's both a comment and with a sense of urgency about it, because I don't want to find out a year from now we're not ready. So
Yeah, I
physically,
think,
physically ready, bring them in. Yeah.
yeah. So I think that, the Amherst School Committee is certainly very keen to get started on the, or restarted on planning process. And so I think we'll, and as a matter of fact, one of the things I need to get done this week, because they want to talk about it next Tuesday when they meet, a little bit is sort of where we sit with sixth grade move and what that's going to take. And not that we have answers to those questions, but we know we have to do that. We also have to consider simultaneously the merging of 3 schools into 2 over the next couple of years simultaneously with that. So there's a whole host of those larger systemic planning kinds of things we need to do relative to this. And so, if the ARPA funds are available still,
I mean that they haven't been spent, and
right.
a part of it was just with the there was conceptually adding $1 million more to the Fort River School parking lot of solar panels, because we had $1 million, but that it turns out that can't go into the contract right away. So I'm just saying that money, there's not a contract for it yet. So if some
Right.
of what you need for the 6th grade is capital money, one time this needs to happen before they can physically move into the school, I think making that a high priority would be a good thing, because the town's capital budget is really tight.
Right.
So Bob has just been, it's not like there's another $500,000 to be grabbed next year. It's in a deficit next year right now, given the request, but in any case,
Yeah.
so I just wanted to emphasize, don't forget that piece of the larger puzzle. And originally the thought was it might help with some of the enrollment and class size, that if some of the 6th graders were taking a Spanish course, were taking this course or that course, it's a few more kids in a classroom that might make those electives viable. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, as we get back into earnestly planning for that 6th grade move, that's all part and parcel of what we're going to be thinking about for sure. Thank you.
Andy?
Yeah, I just was going to suggest to move this along. I really appreciate the amount of time that Doug has spent and with us, and this has been a very rich conversation. There are a lot of things that have been happening within the schools, Doug, and I think that you got cast in the role, and I'm so appreciative that you accepted the role of being the acting superintendent when you did. And it was just an awful time in just this huge combination of circumstances that we don't have to recount because you know them and live them. But I wanted to thank you for, I was going to suggest to the chair that we try and cap the time that we're asking now of Doug, and see if we need to get along to public comment and concluding our meeting.
Yeah, I was going to do that, but thanks, Andy. So thank you, Doug. You can stay for public comment if you want, but you don't need to. So
I may step away, but thank you all. I appreciate the questions, and there's some of the same ones that I have and try to think about regularly. So I appreciate them, and I'll look. You may have sent those to me, and I may have missed them. And
no, I'll get them to you, Doug.
Okay, we'll get them filled out and sit back to you guys as quickly as we can, so you can think through your budget.
Okay,
Absolutely.
thanks.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm going to open the meeting.
Please let Matt back in,
Oh, okay, sorry.
whoever's here.
Let's see, Matt in the attendees.
I think I'm the only one who was granted the power, and Mandy, do you still see him in the audience?
No, I do not. Maybe he left.
I don't think I can bring him in then.
Unless,
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure if he was still here that we brought him in before public comment.
sorry,
Okay.
Unless
Okay,
he's
so
on the
I
phone.
see, I
Uh,
see one hand and it's a phone number, so I'm going to allow phone number 413-549-0810 to talk.
Hi, could you please identify yourself and where you live, just broadly speaking?
Yeah, Vince O'Connor, 175 Summer Street in Amherst. So I've listened to the entire meeting. I have a number of comments, and I'll try to go through them as quickly as I can. One, I wanted just to recall to the Finance Committee my comments from last time about competition. The schools face competition. The services provided by the town do not. You don't drive out of your driveway and decide, well, do I want to drive on the Amherst roads or the Hadley roads or the Belchertown roads? No. We have to live with what we get from the town. But the schools, if they don't provide the services, then people go elsewhere, and that has really bad social impacts as more of the parents decide to put their kids in private schools. And it's very bad impact on the entire town. So second, I just want to say about cooperation with Amherst College and UMass. That's really, I think, a multi-year, at least 1 or 2, but probably 2 or 3 year deal that really has to fall on the new superintendent. And with regard to the chair's comments about wanting to understand the impact on the foreign language budget of the budget cuts, I sat through the entire public hearing that was conducted by the school committee. That hearing was recorded. The comments about especially about the foreign language program, were very concrete, specific, and they had a lot to do with the decision of the school committee with regard to the budget. That meeting was recorded. It is available online. And I would strongly recommend it for any member of the Finance Committee who wants to understand what the impact of the cuts would have. With regard to presentations, I've looked at the 2018 Finance Committee booklet for the last town meeting, and I really recommend that others do the same, because I think some of the presentation material regarding the regional schools in that budget book should be being transferred to the presentations in this time, both by the administration to the school committee and to you all. I do think that with regard to this budget, that the Finance Committee needs to keep in mind that have a new superintendent, a new middle school principal, and I think those 2 hirings are essential for the district to function effectively and properly, and I think nothing would destroy the district's chances of actually hiring somebody than to have the kind of draconian teacher cuts that will result from a reduction in the school committee's budget. And I think in terms of capital things with regard to the town and the region, I'm at a loss to understand why, and I don't expect a response right now, but to understand why there has not been money forthcoming to solarize the high school parking lot and maybe the middle school parking lot. I just, given the fact that it actually leads to expenditure reductions in the out years for energy, I don't understand why money hasn't been able to been set aside for that. Finally, I have questions for, and maybe Doug is gone, but I think it would be useful for the Finance Committee, since the House budget is out, there appears to be perhaps another 100,000 that will go to the region, between 75 and 100,000. And so I think that's another adjustment that has to be made. The budget will be, I think, be debated next week, and all the school things I think will be settled by that time. And so my question for the Finance Committee, which I think is something that the Finance Committee should really think about, because the question is on many people's minds, is the town reserves, the regional school reserves are 1.1 million, and they're going to use, I think, 500,000 or 600,000 of that for the present budget, for the fiscal 25 budget. The municipal reserves are over 20 million, and what will remain of what would be a $740,000 deficit, I think, is down somewhere in the maybe in the 650 range at this point, given the House budget. And the question is, what percentage of the reserves, because I don't know the actual number for the free cash and other funds that are available, what is the actual percentage that the regional school budget ask above the guideline budget would be? In other words, is it appears as though it's in the 3 to 4% range. In other words, that 1 year thing that would allow a new superintendent to come in and try to right what I think has been a rudderless ship for many years, would, I think, be a wise expenditure of money, and with the clear understanding that what it can't come back to next year with the same problem. But there are transportation and administrative issues related to the last-minute promotions and elevations that happened with the prior superintendent that are going to have to be, somebody new is going to have to deal with that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. You need to wrap up your comments. But
yeah, so I will, and I would urge the Finance Committee to look at what the final number is going to be based on the House, at least on the House budget, and what percentage that would be of the actual reserves that are available. I think that's an important number, and I think we could have a meaningful conversation if that number were on the table.
Okay, thank you. Maria, please state your name and where you live.
Thank you, Maria Kapicki, South Amherst. I'm going to talk about a different issue. This past fall, the Finance Committee and the Town Council held many discussions before they took votes to authorize $46 million for the library project. One of the things that came out of these meetings was a cash flow analysis that was supposed to indicate when the town would receive and spend money. Since then, a lot has happened and a lot hasn't happened, but no public body is talking about any of it. The construction bid deadline was set originally for February 28, but this deadline has been pushed back twice so far, first to April 16, then to April 23. That's a 2-month delay. There have been 19 addenda so far to the initial construction documents, the most recent posted today after the subcontractor bids were received, and including multiple sections being replaced in their entirety. Potential bidders have thus far submitted 97 requests for information. When the decision about borrowing was made in the fall, the schedule from the OPM showed a March 2024 construction start and August 2025 completion. In February, the OPM schedule showed a 3-month delay in construction, projected to start in June 2024 with completion in November 2025. This latest, however, was produced before the move to a temporary location was pushed out to mid-May. There's been no discussion about what the financial impacts of these delays are. Subcontractor bids were also pushed back and were finally received last week. There were no bidders for the elevators, so that has to be folded into the general contractor's contract. And there was only one bidder for HVAC, fire protection, and metals. For two others, electrical and roofing, there were only two bidders. In the meantime, the library has failed to meet its promised payment to the town. Less than $250,000 of the $2 million it said it would pay by January 1st was received on time, and $900,000 remains in arrears. If the remainder is not paid before the town has to borrow to pay for construction, interest on those short-term borrowings will presumably be even higher than the more than $750,000 that was estimated in November. This is a public project, and the financial implications of all these issues must be addressed publicly. But through all of these past several months, to my knowledge, no one on the town council or finance committee has demanded any updates, and no information has been forthcoming. The Jones Library Building Committee has met only once, on January 4, more than 3 months ago. Multiple deadline shifts, multiple addenda, scores of RFIs, delinquent payments of almost $1 million, and our elected representatives and town officials are completely silent. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Mika McGee. Please state your name and where you live.
Hi, Lamiko.
Oops, I'm sorry. Ramika, raise your hand again. I hit the wrong button. Here we go.
Gotcha.
You're back.
Back.
Right. You guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Lamiko McGee. I live in Belchertown and I'm the Dean of Students at the middle school. Good afternoon. Mine is not going to be long. We're at a critical point in Amherst. I sit on DESE's Racial Imbalance Advisory Council, and we're able to look at demographic data from all over the state and determine whether schools are segregated or racially diverse. And guess what? Amherst regional schools are racially diverse. We are a school system with nearly a 50% balance of white and non-white students. And our students, whether white or non-white, are also tremendously diverse. This diversity is why I love working in our school district. I'm proud to work here, even in the midst of the storm. Although I think being racially diverse is a strength, we're probably at this point because white families are sending their children to schools elsewhere. All of this diversity creates constant tension. Time will tell how we manage conflicts. Will the school system decline, as is in the case with many communities, white flight, and the defunding of schools? Or will we move forward together? Which direction will we take in this extremely liberal town? The first step is funding our schools. Give us the resources to do right by our students this year. And then, yes, take the school committee and superintendent to task in managing the community's tax dollars efficiently. We need 3-year and 5-year plans that line up with our strategic goals and are fiscally responsible. We have a new school committee who have demonstrated to me that they are dedicated to the best possible outcomes for our students. I'm certain they will work lockstep with our new superintendent to root out inefficiencies in the budget, develop community partnerships to build excellent educational programming, and seek out grant opportunities. I'm sure the regional school committee will use whatever means necessary to maintain the quality of our schools. But today, my friends, they need your help. Cutting the budget at this time of transition and regional leadership will be disastrous. And thank you for listening.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for throwing you out without bringing in. Thanks very much.
Mr. Connor, did you keep your hand up?
Now I see one more, Vince's hand is still up, but I see one more hand went up that hadn't done it.
Tony Cunningham, yes, please bring Tony in. Thank you, Tony. Please state your name and where you live.
Thank you, Tony Cunningham, District 1. So I wasn't planning on talking, but I want to echo and +1 to what Maria Kopicki said about the library. It's kind of shocking that there hasn't been a building committee meeting in over 3 months, and none of the financial implications have been discussed about many of the things that Maria described. And also +1 to what Vince O'Connor said about the schools. I agree, it is a highly competitive market. I have a child in the middle school right now and another one in elementary in the public schools. And I mean, these cuts do make me look elsewhere. The language one in particular is going to really be devastating to the middle school program. And I really think the cut that was made a few years ago was devastating, making 7th grade only 1 semester of language. So the 7th graders really don't make much progress now. And if the same thing happens to the 8th grade, they're going to be starting with level 1 in 9th grade, meaning they're starting at the beginning. So anything the town can do to find funding to prevent these most harmful of cuts would be much appreciated. As I mentioned at a town council meeting recently, many of the increases are beyond the control of the regional school committee. They don't control the Chapter 70 increase being 0.78%. They don't control health insurance going up by 9.74%. And so making the students suffer as a result of some of these increases is really not fair. And I know the town is struggling too, but there was a decision made to give 10.5% of property tax levies to the capital budget. I think that decision needs to be reversed and scale that back so that we can retain the schools at the level that we expect. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comment. I think that's everyone. Is that correct, Kathy?
I don't see anyone. I think that's still Vince's hand that didn't go down, so he's already spoken.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I think we'll close public comment now. Any other comments from the committee?
Just a couple, Bob. You know, in terms of looking forward, we had a discussion, but not a resolution on how we're going to handle the budget. You know, talking to departments, and one suggestion that I think Lynn sent you later was to get some advice from Paul that if we want to focus on some but not all or clusters. So I've still got twice a week for all of May on my calendar, you know, from original. So it would be good to try to get to some clarity on the meeting schedule and who's coming in when. And if we can repeat to Doug what Mandy asked for, and then I asked for again, I think getting more information rather than less when we're dealing with really big budget items, i.e. a regional school or elementary school, we've been getting less and less over the years compared to the very first year that I was on the council. And when I go back to pre-council, some of the documents that the finance committee produced for the town meeting had information in it that I don't think they had to go do research for. I think they got it during their meetings, particularly on schools. I won't, and if you know the town manager's budget document has almost nothing on the school, so if it doesn't flow out of us, it's absent. So that's an issue. Then the comments that we heard today on the library, I've been hearing them a lot from residents on what's happening. So it may not be finance, but just on a scheduling, it may be feeding this back up to the council to get a report on it. Because it's the contingency plan and the flow of money on the library was based on a certain schedule. So I know for a fact, because of JCPC, that the major bond has not gone out yet because until the bids come in, we don't know whether they're even going to come in at the limit. So just, I don't think that's necessarily finance committee, but feed that information up to the council president to figure out where in or otherwise packed. So I think that's my main, just trying to get a better handle. I mean, the meetings are already booked on my calendar, but just getting a sense of how many and how we're going to focus would be great.
Yeah, I actually talked to Athena a little bit about this, and I am going to try to map out, kind of what we had talked about and see how it works, and then we can try to figure where we want to focus in detail on the budget. So,
And I'm right, next week we just had it's not a just, but the regional school hearing, but if you send us something tentative and ask the comments just to come back to you, Paul's back next week, so, we can maybe firm this up a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Then I need a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
I second.
Okay, let's just go around. Just Andy,
Yes.
I'm a yes. Kathy?
Yes,
Okay, so Hannicky?
Aye.
it's unanimous.
We're adjourned at 5:54 p.m. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.